In February 2022, South Korean authorities set out to arrest a military contractor for supplying Taiwan with submarine manufacturing equipment without a government approval. According to a Reuters report from last year, police stated that authorities were concerned about a potential repeat of the extensive sanctions Beijing imposed in 2016 following Seoul's decision to install THAAD.
The South Korean government agreed to deploy a U.S.-made missile defense system called THAAD. And the Chinese government was very unhappy about this.
You're listening to The Divide. My name is Sayre Shi. This week, we continue our conversation with Bethany Allen, an award-winning journalist based in Taiwan and author of the book, Beijing Rules, How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. The book was listed by the Financial Times as one of the best books of 2023. And we are picking up where we left off last week. The story of how China pushed the country to arrest its own citizens due to the fear of becoming a target of Beijing's economic coercion.
South Korea said they were deploying it to, in support of their defense against North Korea. But at least theoretically, the capabilities of this missile defense system would also, China's right there, it would also extend into China. So this upset Beijing. As a result of that, the Chinese government launched a similar kind of comprehensive campaign of economic coercion on South Korea across several industries. So there was this whole comprehensive campaign against the South Korean economy. Now, South Korea, so the government in Seoul did not cancel the THAAD project. They did what they said they were going to do, and they deployed it. However, maybe 2 years ago, so police in South Korea arrested the CEO of a South Korean marine technology firm, which had signed a contract with Taiwan, I think the Taiwanese company, or with Taiwan, to support Taiwan's indigenous submarine development. And in the legal document that these South Korean police used when they arrested the CEO and sued the company, fined the company, not sued the company, when they fined the company, those documents, according to a report by Reuters, explicitly cited what happened with THAAD in 2016. And they said this deal that the South Korean company has made with Taiwan is a national security threat. It breaks our own South Korean national security law because it threatens South Korean national security. And what do they mean by that? What they did was they said it threatens it because it puts us at risk of China's retaliation, similar to what happened in 2016. It means that South Korean authorities are very concerned that China may again use economic coercion against South Korea. And it means that they arrested one of their own nationals and fined the company for behavior that, South Korea is a democracy, Taiwan is a democracy, very close to the U.S., for behavior that supports the continued viability of an important East Asian democracy, which South Korea is as well. So it could be argued that South Korean authorities have been incentivized to go against what would actually be the long-term national security concerns of their own country because of China's economic coercion.
The company was found guilty in 2022, and one of the company's executives was handed a suspended jail sentence. But in January this year, an appeals court overturned the sentence and said that there was no sufficient evidence to consider the equipment as military goods that require export approval from the government, which was what prosecutors had accused the contractor of doing. This example aside, have we played a role in enabling the rise of authoritarian capitalism?
there's a term, neoliberalism, that is used to refer to a set of policies that began to become known. People such as economists such as Milton Friedman began supporting in the late 70s. When Reagan became president in the U.S., he espoused these ideas. So smaller government, less regulation, privatization, unregulated free trade, etc. And in the UK as well, Margaret Thatcher championed neoliberalism. And the US really, during and after Reagan, not only just basically fully adopted the principles of neoliberalism, but also really pushed those principles abroad in a number of ways. And I think for my book, I look at some other aspects of neoliberalism that have made it more difficult to push back against China's use of authoritarian economic statecraft. But in particular, I would say deregulation has been deregulation and the weakening of international institutions has been a key factor in that. And let me explain why. If you have, on two sides, you have a market economy on one side and a market economy on the other side, and you have then two companies who are dealing with each other from each side. It's just one company and one company. So one company versus one company. That's an equal playing field. But what we have actually today is on the U.S. side, you have deregulation. It's the government tries to not get involved in economic decision making, to the best of its ability. And so you have, individual companies making their own, making their own business decisions and trade decisions. But on the Chinese side, backing Chinese companies is the very strong arm of the Chinese state. And so when on the Chinese side, when something is being demanded, you essentially have one U.S. company versus the largest authoritarian one-party state in the world. Who's going to win every single time, right? And so what I mean specifically is that we have seen over and over and over and over companies, people, institutions self-censoring. So they're not going to talk about the Dalai Lama. They're going to avoid talking about Taiwan, or they're going to refer to it as just Taipei, somewhere floating in some countryless space. Or they're not going to talk about China's human rights record, or they're not going to do this, that, or the other. So lots of self-censorship, but not just self-censorship. Actual changing of behavior, and they get really as these anecdotes, these examples have become public. They get really criticized for that. Oh, you're cowards. You're selling out. You're selling your soul for profit, and it's fine. It's fine to criticize them for doing that. However, I don't think it's really fair, because since the 1980s, the message that business owners, CEOs of large corporations have gotten in the U.S. is that your job is to make money. That's all you have to think about. As long as it's legal, you can do it. Just follow the laws, and then everything else is fair game. But the U.S. has at the same time deregulated, so there are fewer laws to follow. And so companies are simply playing by the rules that we have established as a society and as a nation, and as a kind of a democratic body politic. They're just playing by those same rules, but they're facing a country and a political party that is not just a single entity against that. They're facing the entire strength of this, very large country, and they're doing so unaided. Of course, they're going to lose every single time. If you want companies and institutions to change how they act, to change how they behave, we have to change the incentive structure. That's fair and that's right. And regardless of what's fair or right, that would be much more effective. So if the law in the U.S. is that you need to make sure that your supply chains are not using components made with Uyghur forced labor, that's the law, then companies are going to make sure that they're not benefiting from Uyghur forced labor. But before there's a law, none of them are going to do it, because why would they? And so, what I argue in my book, and since since I started my book, there have been a lot more efforts in the U.S. towards re-regulating international trade, reconnecting international trade to our democratic values through the use of law and regulations. There's been a lot of progress in that area, and that makes it an equal playing field. That's not anti-business. That's not anti-profit or anti-capitalism. That is putting the strength of the U.S. government and its laws behind U.S. companies, so that when they are faced with a demand, with an authoritarian demand, an unreasonable political demand from the Chinese side, it is no longer Beijing versus one U.S. company. It is now Beijing versus Washington, D.C. and their laws. And that is an equal playing field.
So based on your investigations, what future scenarios should we be prepared for if liberal democracy continue to be influenced by authoritarian capitalism?
I'm definitely much more optimistic now than I was in 2019 when I first started writing the book, because there is so much greater awareness now of the role that democratic governments need to play. I mean, in 2019, 2018, the term industrial policy, it was practically a bad word. It was, we can't talk about that. What the pandemic did was it kind of shocked everybody gave everybody this crash course on scarcity, on what happens when you have lost control over really important parts of your supply chain. So in the case related to the pandemic, it was PPE, personal protective equipment, and masks, which more than half of the world's supply was made in China. And in the early months of the pandemic, every single person struggled with the need to get a mask and not being able to find one. Now, there was some conspiracy theorizing at that time that the Chinese government had purposefully been stockpiling masks prior to the pandemic, and because they knew there was going to be a pandemic, and maybe they made the pandemic in order to bring the world to its knees. That is just not true. That's a conspiracy theory. Mask production got concentrated in China for the same reasons that many other kinds of products, the manufacturing of many other kinds of products got concentrated in China. But what it did demonstrate to lawmakers across Europe and the US and elsewhere was that simply letting supply chain decisions be made by private companies without thought to what would happen in the case of some kind of, global catastrophe or scenario, that wasn't sufficient, because there's not a profit motive. There's no profit motive to make sure that the U.S. can at least manufacture some of its own, masks or whatever. So it was a kind of a giant shock to the system that re-legitimized the concept of industrial policy. And so now we've seen, since then, across the Europe and the U.S. and other democracies, are a growing number of laws to re-wed the concepts of supply chains and national security, to make sure that supply chains for critical for critical products and technologies and defense sector are secure. Through reshoring or through friend-shoring, just to say making sure that we're getting certain vital components from friendly countries, not from China. So it's been very easy for the U.S. to relatively easy for the U.S. to transition into that kind of thinking when it comes to national security, because the U.S. is very national security obsessed, and it's generally, there's more or less bipartisan consensus that national security is good. Although the two parties tend to sometimes disagree on what it should look like exactly. There has been somewhat less progress in the idea of rejoining or relinking trade to democratic values. It's a harder sell. It's just a harder argument to make. But there have been some major exceptions, really key exceptions, when it comes to Uyghur forced labor. So in the U.S., passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, known by the really fun acronym UFLPA, which prohibits the import of any goods made in Xinjiang unless the importers are able to prove that those components or products are not made, have no components made with forced labor. So it's a presumption that there is forced labor unless you prove otherwise, which is a very high bar. And something like that is incredibly powerful, that also incredibly cumbersome. But that's a really good example of doing something simply because, it's the right thing to do. It's against democracy for us to be profiting from forced labor, especially the kind of forced labor that is used in order to further the aims of a campaign of genocide. But even without, greater, actual like regulation to relink trade with democratic norms and values, there is a much greater, in the past 4 years, we've seen a much greater and continually growing awareness of this issue in general. For example, 6 years ago, there wasn't an agreed upon term to talk about what is this thing that China's doing with its economy where like people feel like they can't talk about stuff. There wasn't a term, but now we all know the term economic coercion. That's great. And also now the term transnational repression is also in common use, and it was not 6 years ago. And part of what China uses economic coercion for is transnational repression, so shutting down the free speech of people with whom it disagrees, particularly vulnerable groups like Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and pro-democracy activists. So I've definitely been very encouraged. There's more that I would like to see. There's more transparency that I would like to see, and there's some structural reforms in the U.S. that I would like to see that are very unrealistic. For example, overturning Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court decision a number of years ago, saying that money was speech, and which expanded the role of campaign donations in U.S. political campaigns. And in my personal opinion, it's much better to have public funding for campaigns, but that's kind of a whole different issue. But anyway, that's kind of where things stand. I am generally encouraged now that this is something that pretty much everyone is aware of, and I'd say at least half the battle.
And throughout your research and writing, what was the most surprising discovery you made about China's global strategy?
I wouldn't call this a discovery, but I think the fact that China has been using economic coercion, or what I call in my book authoritarian economic statecraft, to suppress critical speech and to change behavior beyond its borders for such a long time. And again, tracing it back to 1997, that's 27 years of truly effective use of weaponizing access to its economy to shape the behavior and speech of those beyond its borders to bring them more in line with China's core interests. That's 27 years. And it's really only in the past 5 years that it's been much more almost universally acknowledged as a true phenomenon. It took us being, democratic publics around the world, it took us a really long time to acknowledge that this was happening.
Thank you for listening to The Divide. The time we have with Bethany on this show is way too short for an important subject like this.
If you'd like to learn more, you can find my book on Amazon or in any major bookstore. And in Taiwan, you can purchase a copy at Esleet and other bookstores here. There's 2 editions. The US edition, it's Beijing Rules, How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. The UK edition, which has a different cover, and that's the one that's available in Taiwan. That one is Beijing Rules, China's Quest for Global Influence.
This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.